A British general stood on a hill looking at 56,000 enemy soldiers. He had 36 hours to make a choice that would decide what happened to Europe. Should he attack an impossible position, or watch France take over the continent? What happened next would be called the most perfect battle ever fought. The man who won it would change war forever. But to understand why this moment was so important, we need to go back 4 years to when everything started to fall apart. Today, we're going deep into a battle that saved Europe from French control, made Britain a superpower, and yet has been almost completely forgotten by everyone except military historians who study it with great respect. This is the story of Blenheim. By the end of this video, you'll understand why this single day of fighting in a small German village does more than almost any other battle in British history. You'll see how one man's boldness, combined with smart fighting and clever tricks, changed the balance of power in Europe for the next 100 years. But we can't just jump straight to the battle, because without understanding the background, without feeling how desperate the situation was, without knowing just how impossible the odds were, you can't truly appreciate what Marlborough accomplished. So, let's start at the beginning. In the year 1700, Europe stood on the edge of disaster. King Charles II of Spain was dying. He was the last Habsburg ruler of Spain, and he had no children, no brothers, no direct heirs at all. This might seem like just another royal problem, the kind of thing that happened fairly regularly in European history. But this was different. This was terrible, because Spain in 1700 wasn't just Spain, it was a huge global empire. The Spanish controlled the Netherlands, much of Italy, territories in North Africa, the Philippines, and enormous areas of Central and South America. Spanish treasure ships carried silver and gold from the Americas back to Europe. Spanish trade routes connected 4 continents. Whoever inherited Spain wouldn't just get a crown, they'd get an empire that still stretched around the world. There were 2 main candidates for the Spanish throne. First, there was Philip, Duke of Anjou, the grandson of King Louis XIV of France. Louis XIV, the Sun King, was already the most powerful ruler in Europe. He'd spent his entire reign expanding French power and territory. He'd fought multiple wars against his neighbors. He'd built Versailles, the most magnificent palace in the world, as a symbol of French supremacy. He commanded the largest army in Europe. His court set the standards for fashion, art, and culture across the continent. France under Louis was the dominant power, and everyone knew it. The second candidate was Archduke Charles of Austria, the youngest son of Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I. The Habsburgs had ruled Spain for nearly 2 centuries before Charles II. They saw the Spanish throne as rightfully theirs. Leopold desperately wanted his son to inherit Spain, both for family prestige and because having a Habsburg on the Spanish throne would enormously strengthen the Austrian Empire. Now European powers had tried to solve this problem peacefully. There had been agreements about dividing the Spanish inheritance to keep the balance of power. But Charles II, in his final days, made a decision that destroyed all those careful plans. In November 1700, just weeks before his death, he signed a will leaving the entire Spanish inheritance undivided to Philip of France. He chose a French Bourbon over an Austrian Habsburg. His reasoning was that he wanted to keep the Spanish Empire together, and he believed France was strong enough to defend it. But in doing so, he set Europe on a path to war. When Charles died on November 1, 1700, Philip became King Philip V of Spain. Louis XIV, his grandfather, was thrilled. He just doubled his family's power. He reportedly told the Spanish ambassador, "The Pyrenees no longer exist," suggesting that France and Spain would now act as one. And that's exactly what terrified everyone else in Europe. Think about what this meant. France already had the largest population of any European nation, around 20 million people. Spain had another 8 million, plus millions more in its colonies. France already had the strongest army in Europe. Spain had significant military resources and vast wealth flowing from the Americas. If Louis XIV could effectively control both France and Spain, If he could merge their resources and coordinate their foreign policy, he would create a superpower that could dominate the entire continent. No group of other nations could stand against combined Franco-Spanish might. England saw this as a life-or-death threat. If France controlled Spain, they'd control both sides of the English Channel. They'd dominate Atlantic trade. They'd have the power to invade England with overwhelming force. The Dutch Republic saw the Spanish Netherlands on their southern border falling under French control, which would put French armies right on their doorstep. Austria saw its historic rival gaining enormous strength. Several German states worried about French expansion eastward. Even the Pope was concerned about the balance of power shifting so dramatically. So in 1701, England, the Dutch Republic, Austria, and several other states formed a Grand Alliance. They declared war on France and Spain, fighting to prevent the union of the two crowns, or at minimum to ensure that if Philip remained King of Spain, he would make compromises that limited French influence. England and the Dutch supported Archduke Charles as the rightful King of Spain. The goal was to put a Habsburg back on the Spanish throne and restore the balance of power. This became the War of Spanish Succession, and it would last for 13 years, involve dozens of nations, and be fought on 3 continents. But in 1704, 3 years into the war, things were going terribly badly for the Grand Alliance. France was winning almost everywhere. In Spain itself, Philip was secure on his throne. He had popular support and French military backing. Allied attempts to remove him had failed. In Italy, French forces were gaining ground. In the Netherlands, the war had bogged down into a grinding stalemate with strong French fortifications, making any Allied advance nearly impossible, and most dangerous of all, a French army under Marshal Villars and a Bavarian army under the Elector, Maximilian Emmanuel, had joined forces in southern Germany and were threatening Vienna itself. Let me explain why Bavaria had sided with France. The Elector of Bavaria, Max Emmanuel, was one of the most powerful German princes. He'd fought against the Ottoman Turks and distinguished himself as a military commander, but he had ambitions that Austria and the Empire weren't willing to support. He wanted a crown of his own, perhaps King of the Spanish Netherlands or even King of Lombardy. Louis XIV offered to make those dreams come true. Bavaria would ally with France against the Empire. Max Emmanuel took the deal. In 1702, he signed a secret treaty with France. In 1703, he revealed it publicly, and Bavarian forces joined the French. This was a disaster for the Allies. Bavaria's position in southern Germany opened up a route for French armies to march straight toward Austria. It split the empire geographically. It provided Louis with a powerful ally right in the heart of Germany. And by 1704, French and Bavarian armies were cooperating, advancing on Vienna. If Vienna fell, the war was over. Austria would have to make peace. The Holy Roman Empire, already weak, would effectively collapse. The smaller German states would have to accommodate France. The Dutch would be isolated. England would be left without continental allies, facing a triumphant France-Spain coalition with no way to resist. Louis XIV would dictate the peace terms, and those terms would be devastating from everyone who'd opposed him. The Allied leadership understood all this. They knew Vienna had to be saved. The problem was that the main Allied army, the one capable of confronting the Franco-Bavarian forces, was hundreds of miles away in the Spanish Netherlands, protecting the Dutch Republic. Moving that army south would take months. It would require marching through multiple territories, coordinating with different Allied groups who didn't always cooperate well, and somehow getting to Vienna before the city was surrounded and fell. Most Allied commanders thought it was impossible. The logistics alone seemed overwhelming. Feeding and supplying an army on the march required detailed planning. 18th century armies couldn't move quickly. They were bound to their supply trains. And even if you could get an army to southern Germany, you'd have to fight a Franco-Bavarian force that was larger, well-positioned, and defending on terrain they'd chosen. But there was one man who thought differently, one commander who looked at the situation and saw not impossibility, but opportunity. His name was John Churchill, 1st Duke of Marlborough, and he was about to undertake one of the most daring campaigns in military history. Marlborough, in 1704, was 54 years old, and his life story read like an adventure novel. He'd been born in 1650 to a minor gentry family that had lost much of its wealth in the English Civil War. His father was a royalist who'd followed King Charles II into exile but received little reward when the monarchy was restored in 1660. Young John Churchill had to make his own way in the world, and he did so through a combination of personal charm, tactical brilliance, and carefully calculated risk. Taking at 12, he became a page boy in the household of the Duke of York, the future King James II. This gave him access to the royal court and connections with powerful people. He was handsome, charming, and ambitious, and he used those qualities to advance. When he was 17, he received a commission in the King's Regiment of Foot Guards and saw his first combat in Tangier, fighting against Moorish raiders. He distinguished himself immediately, showing a calmness under fire and tactical instincts that marked him as someone special. He fought in the Third Anglo-Dutch War, serving with distinction at the Battle of Solebay and later at the Siege of Maastricht, where he personally saved the life of the Duke of Monmouth during a desperate assault on the walls. His bravery earned him promotions and royal favour. By the time he was 25, he was a colonel, wealthy from royal gifts, and married to Sarah Jennings, a beautiful and intelligent woman who had become his partner in both love and political manoeuvring. Marlborough's career had its share of setbacks too. He'd navigated the dangerous politics of the Glorious Revolution in 1688, when James II was overthrown and replaced by William of Orange. Marlborough had initially supported James, but switched sides to William at a crucial moment, helping ensure the revolution succeeded without major bloodshed. Some called him a traitor for this. Others called him a pragmatist who put country above personal loyalty. Either way, he survived when others didn't. Under William III, Marlborough commanded Allied forces in Flanders and Ireland, demonstrating his skill at coalition warfare. He understood that fighting as part of an alliance required not just military skill, but diplomatic finesse. You had to manage egos, negotiate compromises, and keep quarreling allies working together. These lessons would prove invaluable. When Queen Anne ascended the throne in 1702, Marlborough's position became even stronger. His wife Sarah was Anne's closest friend and most trusted advisor, and made Marlborough Captain General of English forces and gave him broad authority to conduct the war as he saw fit. She trusted him completely, and that trust was about to be tested in the most dramatic way possible. By May of 1704, Marlborough had concluded that Vienna must be saved, and that he was the one who had to do it. But he faced enormous obstacles, and not just military ones. The Dutch field deputies, civilian officials who accompanied the Dutch contingent of the Allied army, had effective veto power over major military operations. They were cautious men, merchants and politicians, rather than soldiers, and they were terrified of risking the Dutch army in a major battle far from home. They remembered all too well the disaster at Landen in 1693. When the French had nearly destroyed William's army, they weren't going to let that happen again. The Dutch also had strategic priorities that didn't align with saving Vienna. They wanted the army to stay in the Netherlands, protecting their territory from French attack. Marching south would leave them exposed. If Marlborough took the army away and the French attacked, the Dutch Republic could be overrun. The field deputies would never approve such a risk. So Marlborough did something that showed both his genius and his boldness. He decided to deceive his own allies. He would tell the Dutch he was planning a limited campaign on the Moselle River, which wasn't far from the Netherlands and seemed reasonable. They'd approve that. Then once he was on the march, he'd keep going all the way to the Danube before they realized what he was really doing. By the time they figured it out, it would be too late to stop him. This was an enormous gamble. If it failed, if the campaign went badly, or if the Dutch felt betrayed, Marlborough could be dismissed from command. recalled to England in disgrace, maybe even prosecuted. He was risking his reputation, his career, everything he'd built, but he believed it was necessary. Vienna had to be saved, and cautious committee warfare wouldn't save it. Someone had to act decisively, even if that meant bending the rules. In early May, Marlborough began preparing for the march. He contacted Allied commanders along the route, arranging for supply depots to be established at regular intervals. He coordinated with Imperial and German commanders, securing their cooperation. He sent messages to Prince Eugene of Savoy, the Austrian commander, explaining his plan and requesting that Eugene bring his forces to link up with the main army. And he told the Dutch he was planning to campaign on the Moselle, a limited operation to pressure France from that direction. The Dutch field deputies approved. They thought Marlborough was planning a sensible, limited campaign. They had no idea he intended to march his entire army across Germany. On May 19th, the march began. 40,000 men, including British, Dutch, Danish, and German troops, plus thousands of horses, hundreds of wagons, and all the supplies needed to keep an army functioning, left their camps in the Netherlands and headed south. Marlborough had organized everything with careful attention to detail. Supply depots waited along the route with bread, meat, beer, and fodder for the horses. Cobblers had been hired to have new shoes ready, because soldiers marching long distances would wear through their footwear. Hospitals were prepared to receive sick and injured men. Nothing was left to chance. The army marched in good order, covering 15 to 20 miles per day, which was excellent time for an 18th century force. Morale remained high because the men were well fed and well supplied. Compare this to most armies of the era, which simply took food from the countryside, leaving a trail of destruction and arriving at their destination exhausted and starving. Marlborough understood that logistics win wars. An army that's hungry, tired, and diseased can't fight effectively. Take care of your soldiers, and they'll take care of you. As the army moved south, crossing into German territories, Marlborough still maintained the lie that he was heading for the Moselle. He sent scouting parties in that direction. He talked about his plans for operations on that river, but all the while, he was positioning his forces to keep marching south. He was also watching for the moment when he'd have to reveal his true intentions, and he timed it perfectly. By the time the Dutch deputies realized what was happening, the army was so far from the Netherlands that there was no point in turning back. They were furious, but they couldn't stop him. Marlborough had committed them to his plan, whether they liked it or not. On June 10th, after covering more than 200 miles in less than a month, Marlborough's army reached the town of Blenheim on the Danube River. They had accomplished one of the most remarkable strategic movements in military history. An army of 40,000 men had marched across Germany, maintaining discipline and unity, arriving in excellent condition and ready to fight. It was a logistical and organizational triumph, and it had been done in complete secrecy, catching the French completely by surprise. Waiting for Marlborough at the Danube was Prince Eugene of Savoy, and the meeting between these two men would prove to be one of the most significant military partnerships in history. Eugene was 40 years old in 1704, a small, thin man who looked more like a scholar than a soldier, but appearances were deceiving. Eugene was one of the greatest military minds of his generation, aggressive, intuitive, and fearless. Eugene had been born in Paris, oddly enough, to a French mother and an Italian father. He'd wanted to join the French army, but Louis XIV had refused him a commission, apparently thinking he was too small and weak to be a soldier. Insulted and angry, Eugene had left France and offered his services to Austria. The Austrians gave him command, and he'd spent the last 20 years proving Louis wrong. He'd fought the Ottoman Turks in Hungary, winning stunning victories at Zenta and elsewhere. He'd campaigned in Italy against the French. He was known for his daring attacks, his willingness to take risks, and his ability to inspire soldiers to follow him into impossible situations. When Marlborough and Eugene met, They took an immediate liking to each other. Despite their different backgrounds and personalities, they shared a common vision of how to fight the war. They both believed in aggressive action. They both understood the importance of seizing the initiative. They both were willing to take calculated risks. And they both had utter contempt for the cautious defensive warfare that to many Allied commanders favored. They also complemented each other perfectly. Marlborough was diplomatic, patient, skilled at managing the complex politics of coalition warfare. Eugene was aggressive, impatient, willing to push hard and damn the consequences. Marlborough thought strategically, seeing the big picture. Eugene thought tactically, focused on the immediate fight. Together, they made an unbeatable combination, but even united, they faced a serious problem. The Franco-Bavarian army was formidable. Marshal Camille de Talard had arrived from Alsace with French reinforcements, bringing the total enemy strength to about 56,000 men. The Elector of Bavaria commanded the Bavarian contingent. Marshal Marzin commanded another French corps. These were experienced commanders with veteran troops, and they were operating in friendly territory with good supply lines and strong fortifications. Marlborough and Eugene had about 52,000 men between them, slightly outnumbered. Worse, they were operating at the end of a very long supply line. They were in enemy territory. They had limited siege equipment and would struggle to capture the strong fortresses in Bavaria, and time was against them. If they couldn't force a decisive battle soon, their campaign might fail simply from lack of supplies and the approach of winter. The French and Bavarian commanders understood all this. Their strategy was simple: avoid battle, stay behind fortifications, and wait for Marlborough to exhaust himself trying to force a fight. Time and logistics would do the work for them. They didn't need to defeat Marlborough in open battle. They just needed to survive until he had to retreat. So for several weeks in June and July, Marlborough and Eugene maneuvered, trying to bring the enemy to battle. They marched toward Bavarian strongholds, threatening to surround them. The enemy would withdraw behind fortifications. They'd try to cut enemy supply lines. The enemy would reposition. It was a frustrating game of cat and mouse, and Marlborough knew he couldn't win it. He needed the enemy to come out and fight. Then in late July, Marlborough did something unexpected. He launched a surprise assault on the town of Rain on the Danube. Rain wasn't strategically crucial, but capturing it threatened enemy supply lines. Then he made a show of preparing to surround Ingolstadt, another Bavarian fortress. He moved artillery into position. He began digging siege works. He made it look like he was committing to a long siege. This finally provoked the reaction he wanted. Marshal Talard, who'd been waiting in Alsace, received orders to march to Bavaria with reinforcements and relieve Ingolstadt. More importantly, the combined Franco-Bavarian army decided they needed to confront Marlborough before he could take Ingolstadt. They couldn't let him capture their fortresses one by one. They had to fight. But here's the brilliant part: Marlborough never intended to actually take Ingolstadt. The siege preparations were a trick, a deception to draw the enemy out. Once he got word that Talard was marching with reinforcements and the Franco-Bavarian army was preparing to seek battle, Marlborough abandoned the siege and maneuvered to meet them. The French commanders, realizing they'd been tricked into leaving their fortifications, tried to recover. Tallard's reinforcements arrived, boosting their numbers. They looked for a good defensive position where they could make Marlborough attack them on unfavorable terms. They found it near a small village called Blenheim, which English speakers would call Blenheim. On August 12th, French scouts confirmed that Tallard's entire army had taken up a strong defensive position along the Danube, anchored on the river at one end and hills at the other, with 3 fortified villages spacing their line and a marshy stream called the Nebel protecting their center. It was an excellent position. Talard was confident. He had more men, better ground, and strong defenses. Let the Allies attack if they dared. They'd be smashed against French lines and destroyed. That evening, Marlborough and Eugene rode forward with a small escort to personally scout the enemy position. This was risky. If French cavalry spotted them, they could be captured or killed. But Marlborough insisted on seeing the ground himself. He needed to understand the terrain, the enemy deployments, every detail that would matter in battle. What he saw would have discouraged most commanders. The French and Bavarian army stretched nearly 4 miles far too long to flank. The Nebel stream in front of their centre position was bordered by marshes that would slow any attacking force. The 3 villages Blenheim, Oberglau, and Lutzingen were heavily fortified and garrisoned with elite troops. French cavalry filled the gaps between the villages. Artillery was positioned to sweep the approaches. It was a formidable defensive array. But Marlborough's trained eye saw something others might have missed. The French had made several subtle mistakes in their deployment. First, they'd packed too many troops into Blenheim village itself. Marlborough could see the banners of multiple battalions crowded into a small space. That was inefficient. Those troops couldn't maneuver or support each other properly. If they stayed in Blenheim, they'd be wasted. If they tried to deploy out of the village during battle, they'd be vulnerable. Second, the French line was stretched too thin in the centre. To cover 4 miles of front, Talad had to spread his forces across a wide area. His centre, between Blenheim and Oberglau, looked undermanned. The French had positioned cavalry there, backed by a smaller number of infantry, but it wasn't as strong as the flanks. Third, the Nebel stream, while a good defensive obstacle, also limited the French ability to counterattack. If the Allies got across the stream and established a strong position on the far side, the French would have difficulty driving them back. Marlborough saw all this in the fading light of evening on August 12th, and he made his decision. He would attack at dawn. He would pin the French forces in Blenheim and Lutzingen with diversionary attacks, preventing them from reinforcing the centre. Then he would force a crossing of the Nebel with his main strength and smash through the French centre, splitting their army in two and destroying it piece by piece. It was a daring plan. Crossing a river in the face of the enemy is one of the most difficult military operations. Doing so while under artillery and cavalry attack could lead to disaster. British and Allied troops struggling through marshy water would be vulnerable, disorganized, possibly cut to pieces before they could form up to fight. Most 18th century commanders would never attempt such a crossing against a prepared enemy. The risk was too high. But Marlborough had several advantages. First, he had excellent troops, well trained and disciplined, who would maintain their unity even under fire. Second, he had numerical near parity with the enemy, which meant he could absorb casualties and still maintain the attack. Third, he had Eugene, who would command the right wing and could be trusted to execute his part of the plan with determination and skill. Fourth, he had the element of surprise. The French expected him to avoid battle, not launch an all-out assault on a strong defensive position. And fifth, most importantly, Marlborough had absolute confidence in his own judgment. He'd studied the ground, analysed the enemy deployment, calculated the odds, and decided he could win. That confidence would communicate itself to his soldiers. They'd follow him because they trusted him, and that trust was about to be tested as never before. That night, Marlborough called his senior officers together and explained the plan. Eugene would take about 18,000 men and attack Lutzingen and the Bavarian left flank. His objective wasn't to capture Lutzingen necessarily, but to pin the Bavarian and French forces there so they couldn't reinforce the centre. It would be hard fighting, but Eugene understood his role. Lord Cutts, commanding a smaller force on the Allied left, would attack Blenheim village with about 11 battalions. Again, his objective wasn't to capture the village, though if he could, that would be a bonus. His real job was to pin down the massive French garrison there and prevent them from joining the fight elsewhere. The main effort would come in the centre, where Marlborough would personally lead the bulk of the Allied cavalry and infantry across the Nebel, engage the French centre, and break through. This was where the battle would be won or lost. If Marlborough could get across the stream in good order, maintain his formations, and bring his full strength to bear on the French centre, he believed he could overwhelm them. The plan required almost perfect coordination across 4 miles of battlefield, with no way to communicate in real time except by sending galloping messengers. If any part failed, if Eugene was defeated, or if Cutts couldn't hold the French in Blenheim, or if Marlborough's crossing was repulsed, the entire army could be destroyed. It was the kind of all-or-nothing gamble that could make or break careers, and Marlborough was staking everything on his judgment. His officers listened in silence. Then, one by one, they nodded. They'd follow him. They'd always followed him, and he'd never led them to defeat. If Corporal John said they could win, they'd believe him. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the Allied army began to move. In darkness, with only starlight and the occasional torch to guide them, 52,000 men marched toward the French position. It was slow, careful work. Units had to stay together, maintain their order, move quietly. The French had sentries out, and if they gave too much warning, the element of surprise would be lost. But fog had rolled in from the Danube, thick and clammy, reducing visibility to a few yards. The Allied army moved through these fog like ghosts, getting closer and closer to the French lines without being detected. It was almost eerie, this vast force moving in near silence, save for the muffled sound of thousands of feet, the jingle of harness, the quiet commands of officers. At 6 o'clock, as the first light of dawn began to penetrate the fog, French sentries finally spotted the Allied army. They were there, deployed for battle, less than a mile away. Battle lines formed, banners flying, tens of thousands of men ready to fight. Alarm guns fired. French drums beat the assembly. Soldiers ran to their positions. Officers shouted orders. The French and Bavarian army scrambled to prepare for an attack they hadn't expected. Marshal Tallard, sleeping in a house in Blenheim village, was woken by his aides. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. The Allies were attacking in force against this position. It seemed insane. He rushed out to see for himself. And yes, there they were, the entire Allied army deployed and advancing. For a moment, Tallard felt a mix of emotions. Surprise, certainly, but also confidence. Let them come. They'd break themselves against French defenses. This battle would be the decisive victory Louis XIV wanted. The Allied army would be destroyed. Vienna would fall, and the war would be won. He was about to learn that he had severely underestimated his opponent. At 8 o'clock, as the fog began to lift and the morning sun broke through, Allied artillery opened fire. 60 guns positioned along the front began hammering the French lines with solid shot and explosive shells. The French artillery responded immediately. The ground shook with the noise of cannon fire. Smoke rolled across the battlefield, mixing with the remnants of fog. Cannonballs plowed through formations, killing men with brutal efficiency. Artillery in the 18th century was devastating but imprecise. A cannonball could smash through a dozen men if it hit a tightly packed formation. But aiming was difficult, and many shots missed. The psychological effect was as important as the physical damage. The constant thunder of guns, the screaming of men hit by shot, the sight of comrades torn apart, all of it tested soldiers' courage before they even engaged the enemy. On the Allied right wing, Prince Eugene launched his attack toward Lutzingen. This was difficult terrain, broken and hilly, not ideal for military formations. Eugene's troops had to advance uphill against prepared positions, Bavarian and French. Soldiers waited behind earthworks and in the village itself. As Eugene's men came into musket range, they were met with devastating volleys of fire. 18th century muskets were smoothbore weapons, inaccurate beyond 50 yards, but deadly at close range. Infantry tactics revolved around getting close, enough to deliver effective volleys, then charging with the bayonet. Eugene's troops advanced in disciplined lines, colours flying, drums beating, straight into the teeth of enemy fire. The first ranks went down in heaps, but the men behind stepped over their fallen comrades and kept coming. They returned fire, loading and firing as quickly as they could, aiming low into the enemy formations. Smoke became so thick that soldiers could barely see. They fired into the white clouds, hoping to hit something, The noise was deafening, a constant crackle of musketry mixed with the screams of wounded men, and the shouts of officers trying to maintain control. Eugene's attack stalled. The Bavarians and French held their ground. Eugene reorganized his troops and attacked again and again. Each assault was repulsed with heavy casualties, but Eugene understood his mission. He didn't need to capture Lutzingen. He needed to pin the enemy there, and he was succeeding. Every Bavarian soldier focused on defending Lutzingen was a soldier who couldn't reinforce the French center. Eugene was buying time and space for Marlborough, and he paid for it in blood. On the Allied left, Lord Cutts launched his attack on Blenheim village at around the same time. Cutts was a legend in the British army, a man who seemed to have no fear. He'd been wounded multiple times in previous battles and had earned his nickname Salamander because he moved through fire unscathed. His soldiers loved him and would follow him anywhere. Now he was asking them to assault a fortified village packed with French elite infantry. The approach to Blenheim was across open ground, offering little cover. French infantry lined the walls and barricades, muskets ready. Cutts's British and Hessian battalions advanced in perfect order, a demonstration of disciplined courage that was both inspiring and terrible to watch. They marched in step, maintaining their alignment, flags flying, colors bright against the smoke-filled morning. At 200 yards, the French opened fire. The first volley was devastating, cutting down dozens of men. But the Allied soldiers closed ranks and kept advancing. At 100 yards, another volley. More men fell. Still they came. At 50 yards, the French unleashed everything they had. Musketry coming so fast it sounded like one continuous roar. The first British regiment to reach the village was virtually destroyed. They charged forward, bayonets fixed, trying to get over the barricades and into the village where they could use cold steel. But the French position was too strong. Soldiers fell with every step. Those who made it to the barricades were shot at point-blank range or bayoneted by defenders. The attack broke. Survivors fell back to reorganize. Cutts rallied his men and ordered another assault. Again, British and Hessian infantry advanced into the killing ground. Again, they were repulsed with terrible losses. The ground in front of Blenheim was covered with dead and wounded men. But Cutts kept attacking. He knew his job: pin the French garrison in Blenheim, keep them so busy defending they can't leave the village. He was succeeding, but at a horrific cost. Inside Blenheim, the French commander, the Marquis de Clarambeau, was making a crucial mistake. He saw the ferocity of the British attacks and concluded he was facing the main Allied assault. He believed Cutts had far more troops than he actually did. Panicking, Clarambeau called for reinforcements. More French battalions marched into Blenheim, adding to the already overcrowded garrison. This was exactly what Marlborough had hoped for. Every French soldier packed into Blenheim was a soldier who wouldn't be in the center. Clarambeau had 27 battalions in Blenheim with 10,000 men squeezed into a village that couldn't effectively deploy more than a fraction of that number. They were trapped by their own success in holding the village. Marlborough had removed a quarter of the French army from the battle without defeating them, just by convincing them they were under threat. While Eugene fought on the right and Cutts attacked on the left, Marlborough prepared for the main effort in the center. He had to get his troops across the Nebel stream and establish a strong position on the far side. But the Nebel was a formidable obstacle. It wasn't a simple stream. It was bordered on both sides by marshy ground. And while the water itself wasn't deep, the approach and exit were difficult. Troops would have to struggle through mud, wade through water, climb up the far bank, all while under fire from French cavalry and artillery. Marlborough had prepared for this. He'd sent pioneers forward overnight to identify the best crossing points and, where possible, to construct makeshift bridges and causeways using fascines, bundles of sticks and branches. These weren't substantial structures, but they'd help. He'd also positioned his artillery to provide covering fire, suppressing the French guns and cavalry, while his troops crossed at around noon. With Eugene and Cutts fully engaged on the flanks, Marlborough gave the order. The first wave of Allied cavalry and infantry began moving toward the Nebel. They advanced at a steady pace, maintaining formation. Officers rode up and down the lines, keeping men together. French artillery opened fire as soon as the Allied troops came into range. Cannonballs smashed into the advancing formations. Gaps appeared where men had been standing moments before, but the advance continued. This required incredible discipline and courage. Soldiers had to march steadily forward, watching their comrades be killed around them, knowing they might be next all, while maintaining perfect order. The first squadrons of Allied cavalry reached the Nebel and began crossing. Horses plunged into the water, struggling through the mud on both banks. Some animals lost their footing and went down, throwing their riders. But most made it across. On the far side, cavalrymen reformed their squadrons as quickly as they could, trying to establish a foothold before the French counterattacked, but the French weren't waiting passively. Marshal Talard had finally realized that this was the main Allied attack, that Marlborough was coming straight for his center. He ordered his cavalry forward. Squadrons of French horsemen, among the finest in Europe, charged toward the Nebel, aiming to catch the Allied troops while they were disorganized and vulnerable. The first clash came. The Allied cavalry was still forming up after their crossing. French squadrons smashed into them with devastating effect. This was cavalry combat at its most brutal, men hacking at each other with sabers, firing pistols at point-blank range, horses biting and kicking. The Allied squadrons, not yet fully formed, gave ground. Some broke and retreated back across the Nebel. French cavalry pursued, cutting down fleeing soldiers. For a moment, it looked like the crossing might fail. French cavalry had gained the initiative, and if they could maintain it, they could throw the Allies back and hold the line of the Nebel. The battle was balanced on a knife's edge, but Marlborough had anticipated this. He'd held back substantial reserves, and now he committed them. Fresh Allied cavalry squadrons charged across the Nebel and hit the French cavalry in the flank. While they were pursuing the first wave, the impact was tremendous. French cavalry, expecting an easy pursuit, suddenly found themselves under attack from a new direction. The fighting became a massive swirling melee with thousands of horsemen locked in combat. And Marlborough himself was in the thick of it. He personally led several charges, rallying his troops by example. On multiple occasions, he came within feet of French cavalrymen who would have killed or captured him, as they had recognized who he was. At one point, his aide-de-camp riding next to him was killed by a cannonball that passed so close to Marlborough it must have brushed his coat, but Marlborough seemed charmed, untouchable. His soldiers saw him, saw that he was willing to risk his life alongside them, and they fought with renewed determination. The fighting in the center became the decisive point of the battle. For several hours, the struggle raged. Allied and French cavalry charged and countercharged. Neither side could gain a permanent advantage. Men and horses fell by the hundreds. The Nebel became choked with bodies. The ground on both sides was slick with blood. But gradually, inexorably, the balance shifted. More Allied troops got across the Nebel. Marlborough's superior organization and logistics showed. His troops maintained their unity better. They rallied faster after being repulsed. They coordinated their attacks more effectively. The French cavalry, fighting magnificently, but without the same level of support and organization, began to tire. And the French had another problem. Because Talard had allowed so many troops to be drawn into Blenheim village, his center was undermanned. He'd positioned cavalry there, but he didn't have enough infantry to properly support them. As Allied infantry began crossing the Nebel and forming up on the far side, they created a solid base of support for the Allied cavalry. The French cavalry, without equivalent infantry support, were increasingly vulnerable. Meanwhile, on the flanks, Eugene and Cutts were holding. Eugene's troops had fought themselves to exhaustion against the Bavarians, but they'd succeeded in their mission. The Bavarian wing was fully committed to defense and couldn't spare troops to help the center. Cuts had kept the massive French garrison in Blenheim completely occupied. Clerambault still hadn't realized he was supposed to be attacking, not defending. He kept his troops in the village, convinced they were under imminent assault, while the real battle happened elsewhere. By mid-afternoon, Marlborough had built up overwhelming strength in the center. He had more cavalry across the Nebel than the French could match. He had infantry providing fire support. He had artillery positioned to hammer the French positions. The time had come for the decisive blow. Marlborough organized his forces for one massive coordinated attack. Every unit in the center would advance simultaneously. Cavalry would charge on both flanks. Infantry would advance in the middle, delivering volleys of musket fire. Artillery would provide support. It would be an overwhelming assault that would shatter whatever remained of French resistance. At around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Marlborough gave the order to advance. Across the Allied center, trumpets sounded, drums beat, and the entire force surged forward. Thousands of cavalrymen charged in perfect order, squadrons aligned, sabers drawn. Infantry marched forward with leveled muskets, ready to fire. It must have been a terrifying sight for the French defenders, this massive wall of enemy soldiers advancing with unstoppable momentum. The French center tried to hold. French cavalry charged to meet the assault. Some French infantry battalions hastily moved up to support the cavalry, formed lines, and fired volleys, but they were outnumbered and outflanked. The Allied attack came from multiple directions simultaneously. French units found themselves under attack from the front and both sides at once. The French center began to fall apart. French cavalry units, after hours of fighting, were exhausted and could no longer maintain their unity. They broke and fled. French infantry battalions, seeing cavalry riding through them in retreat, lost their nerve and joined the rout. Within minutes, what had been an organized defensive position became a panicked mass of fleeing soldiers. Marshal Talard, watching his center collapse, tried desperately to rally his troops. He rode among the fleeing soldiers, shouting orders, trying to restore some semblance of order. But it was hopeless. The rout had become a stampede. Thousands of French soldiers were fleeing toward the Danube, looking for any way to escape the victorious Allies. In the chaos, Talard became separated from his staff. He was riding through what he thought was French-controlled territory when he suddenly found himself surrounded by Allied cavalry. They demanded his surrender. Talard, realizing the battle was lost and that he was captured, handed over his sword to a British lieutenant colonel. The commander of the Franco-Bavarian army had been taken prisoner. The capture of Talard sealed the fate of the French army. With their center broken and their commander captured, the French right wing collapsed completely. Thousands of French soldiers found themselves trapped between the advancing Allies and the Danube River. The river here was deep and fast-flowing, almost impossible to swim across, especially for men in full uniform and equipment. Desperate French soldiers tried anyway. They plunged into the water, hoping to reach the far bank. Most drowned, pulled under by the current or the weight of their equipment. The Danube was soon choked with bodies floating downstream. Those who didn't try to swim were cut down by Allied cavalry or surrendered. On the flanks, the remaining French and Bavarian forces saw what had happened and began to retreat. Eugene's exhausted troops pursued the Bavarians, but they didn't have the strength for a vigorous chase. The Elector of Bavaria fled the field, his army broken, his alliance with France in ruins. That left only the French garrison in Blenheim village. Over 10,000 elite French infantry, among the best soldiers in Europe, still held the village. They were undefeated, still in good order, their morale intact, but they were completely surrounded, cut off, with no hope of relief. As evening fell, Marlborough sent envoys to demand their surrender. The French officers in Blenheim initially refused. They were prepared to fight their way out or die trying, but as they assessed their situation, the reality became clear. They were surrounded by the entire victorious Allied army. They had no artillery support, no cavalry, no supply. They couldn't break out. and the last stand would accomplish nothing except getting thousands of men killed for no purpose. At 9 o'clock in the evening, as darkness settled over the battlefield, the garrison of Blenheim surrendered. 27 battalions of French infantry, over 10,000 men, laid down their arms and marched out of the village as prisoners of war. It was one of the largest surrenders of troops in European warfare up to that time. The Battle of Blenheim was over. In one day of fighting, from dawn to dusk, Marlborough and Eugene had achieved one of the most complete victories in military history. The Franco-Bavarian army had been destroyed. French casualties were staggering, perhaps 12,000 killed or wounded, 15,000 captured, including the entire garrison of Blenheim and Marshal Talleyrand himself. The French had lost all their artillery, over 100 guns. They'd lost their baggage, supplies, ammunition, everything. 128 French regimental colours and battle standards had been captured, physical symbols of French defeat. The Allied losses were also heavy, about 12,000 casualties in total, with Eugene's wings suffering disproportionately. These were terrible numbers, representing thousands of families that would receive news that husbands, fathers, sons would never return. But they had won a victory that would change the course of the war and European history. The immediate strategic consequences were profound. The threat to Vienna evaporated overnight. French armies began retreating back across the Rhine. The Elector of Bavaria fled into exile, his electorate occupied by Allied forces. The entire Franco-Bavarian position in southern Germany collapsed. Not only had Vienna been saved, but the initiative in the war had completely shifted to the Allies. When news of the victory reached England, the country exploded in celebration. This was the greatest military triumph England had achieved in generations. Church bells rang across the nation. Bonfires were lit in every town and village. In London, crowds filled the streets, celebrating until dawn. Queen Anne, overwhelmed with joy and gratitude, declared that Marlborough would be rewarded beyond any previous general in British history. She granted him the royal manor of Woodstock in Oxfordshire and promised to build him a palace there at public expense. That palace, designed by John Vanbrugh, would take decades to complete and would be named Blenheim Palace, a permanent monument to the battle. It remains one of the grandest stately homes in England, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and the birthplace of Winston Churchill, Marlborough's famous descendant. The impact of Blenheim echoed across Europe. In Paris, the news was received with shock and disbelief. Louis XIV's court, accustomed to French military dominance, couldn't comprehend how their army had been so thoroughly defeated. The myth of French invincibility was shattered. Louis would continue the war for another 9 years, but he would never again come close to the overwhelming dominance he'd enjoyed before Blenheim. In Vienna, there was jubilation. The city had been saved, the empire preserved. Marlborough and Eugene were celebrated as heroes. The Holy Roman Emperor awarded Marlborough the title of Prince of the Holy Roman Empire, an almost unprecedented honor for an Englishman. But the true significance of Blenheim went beyond immediate celebrations. This battle fundamentally altered the balance of power in Europe in ways that would shape the continent for the next century. First, it established Britain as a major military power on the European continent. Before Marlborough, British armies were often dismissed as secondary forces, useful for naval operations and colonial warfare, but not serious contenders in major European conflicts. After Blenheim, no one doubted British military capabilities. Britain had demonstrated that it could project power deep into Europe, win major battles against the best armies in the world, and do so with a level of professionalism and effectiveness that few could match. Second, it ended any possibility of a unified Franco-Spanish Bourbon superstate. Louis XIV's dream of combining French and Spanish power under his dynasty was finished. While Philip would remain King of Spain, the eventual peace settlement would include provisions ensuring France and Spain remained separate. Blenheim made it clear that Europe would not tolerate French dominance. Third, it secured the Protestant succession in England and, by extension, the political settlement of the Glorious Revolution. If France had won the war, Louis would have supported Catholic claimants to the English throne, possibly James II's son. Blenheim helped ensure that when Queen Anne died in 1714, the throne passed peacefully to the Protestant Hanoverian line, maintaining the constitutional monarchy established in 1689. Fourth, the victory gave Britain enormous diplomatic leverage in the eventual peace negotiations. The Peace of Utrecht in 1713, which ended the War of Spanish Succession, gave Britain Gibraltar and Minorca, providing permanent bases in the Mediterranean. Britain gained significant trade concessions in Spanish America, including the Jacinto, the contract to supply slaves to Spanish colonies, which was enormously profitable. Britain's position as a trading nation and nascent imperial power was dramatically strengthened. Fifth, and perhaps most important from a military perspective, Blenheim demonstrated that modern warfare required not just brave soldiers, but brilliant planning, meticulous logistics, strategic deception, and tactical flexibility. Marlborough's campaign was a masterclass in what we'd now call operational art. He integrated strategy, logistics, intelligence, and tactics into a seamless whole. He thought several moves ahead like a chess grandmother, and he proved that the right commander with the right plan could overcome apparently insurmountable odds. Military academies have studied Blenheim for centuries. The strategic march from the Netherlands to the Danube is taught as an example of operational mobility. The tactical coordination of the battle itself, with simultaneous attacks on both flanks and the center, demonstrates combined arms warfare at its finest. Marlborough's use of deception, both in concealing his strategic objective from his own allies and in feinting toward Ingolstadt to draw the enemy into battle, shows the importance of military intelligence and information warfare. The battle also revealed something profound about leadership. Marlborough commanded an alliance army made up of contingents from different nations, speaking different languages, with different military traditions and different political objectives. Managing that coalition, keeping everyone working together, resolving disputes, and maintaining unity of purpose required diplomatic skills as important as military ones. Marlborough succeeded because he understood that winning battles required more than tactics. It required managing complex human relationships and political dynamics. His personal leadership on the battlefield was equally important. Marlborough led from the front, sharing the dangers with his soldiers. They saw him in the thick of the fighting, exposed to the same fire they faced. That bred a level of trust and loyalty that few commanders achieve. When Marlborough asked his men to do something dangerous, they did it without hesitation, because they knew he wouldn't ask them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. Eugene of Savoy's role shouldn't be overlooked either. His wings suffered the heaviest casualties, fighting through difficult terrain against determined opposition for hours. Eugene's mission was to pin enemy forces and prevent them from reinforcing the center, and he accomplished it despite terrible losses. His willingness to accept a supporting role, to take on the hardest fighting, while Marlborough delivered the decisive blow, demonstrates the kind of professional unselfishness that makes coalition warfare possible. Lesser commanders might have refused such a role or executed it half-heartedly. Eugene threw everything he had into his mission, because he understood that's what winning required. The human cost of Blenheim, as mentioned earlier, was staggering 24,000 casualties in a single day, in an era when entire armies were sometimes smaller than that. Each of those casualties represented a person, someone with a family, friends, dreams. The wounded faced primitive medical care that often did more harm than good. Many would die of infections in the days and weeks following the battle. Survivors might be crippled for life. Families would be devastated by news of fathers and sons who would never return. We should remember that while we celebrate Marlborough's victory, and rightly so, the reality of 18th century warfare was brutal beyond modern imagination. Soldiers stood in tight formations while cannonballs tore through their ranks. They advanced into musket fire that could kill a man at 50 yards. They fought hand to hand with sabers and bayonets. Medical care consisted of amputation, without anesthesia and bandages that often introduced infection. The courage required to do this day after day, battle after battle, is almost incomprehensible, yet they did it. British, Dutch, Danish, German, Austrian soldiers all fought with incredible bravery at Blenheim. So did their French and Bavarian opponents, who were equally courageous, equally committed. This wasn't a battle between good and evil. It was a clash between professional soldiers doing their duty for their respective nations. So why has Blenheim faded from popular memory? Several factors contributed to its relative obscurity in modern times. First, the War of Spanish Succession itself is complex and hard to explain to modern audiences. Multiple nations, shifting alliances, dynastic politics. It doesn't have the clear narrative that makes other conflicts easy to understand. Explaining why Blenheim mattered requires first explaining the entire context of the war, and that can be challenging. Second, Blenheim wasn't the final decisive battle of the war. Fighting continued for another 9 years after Blenheim, with multiple other battles and campaigns. While Blenheim was strategically decisive in saving Vienna and turning the war in the Allies' favour, it didn't immediately end the conflict. Waterloo is remembered partly because it definitively ended the Napoleonic Wars. Blenheim saved the alliance, but didn't end the war. Third, the battle took place in what's now Germany, far from British soil. It wasn't defending Britain directly, wasn't protecting British territory. For modern British audiences, battles fought on British soil or defending Britain itself naturally resonate more. Blenheim was fought for larger strategic reasons that require explanation to understand. Fourth, Marlborough's subsequent victories, Ramillies in 1706, Audinad in 1708, and Malplaquet in 1709, somewhat overshadowed Blenheim. Marlborough never lost a battle in his entire career. He won so consistently that his victories almost seemed routine. That very success made each individual victory less remarkable. When you always win, people start taking your victories for granted. Fifth, Marlborough's later years were marked by political controversy. He fell out of favour with Queen Anne in 1711, partly due to political machinations by his rivals, partly due to Anne's changing political views. He was dismissed from command and actually fled to the continent for a time, living in self-imposed exile. When Anne died and George I became king, Marlborough returned to favour, but the damage to his reputation had been done. The political controversies complicated his legacy. Finally, as wars became larger and more destructive in the 19th and 20th centuries, Blenheim's scale seemed less impressive to modern audiences familiar with World War I, where single battles could produce 1 million casualties. Blenheim's 24,000 casualties seems almost small. Of course, in context, for early 18th century Europe, Blenheim was absolutely massive, but perspective matters. Despite these factors, military historians have never forgotten Blenheim. It remains a case study in how to conduct military operations at the highest level. The strategic march, the tactical coordination, the personal leadership, the diplomatic management of allies, all of it came together perfectly in a way that's rarely been matched. Winston Churchill, writing his 4-volume biography of Marlborough in the 1930s, devoted enormous attention to Blenheim. Churchill clearly saw parallels between his ancestors' fight against French hegemony and his own coming fight against Nazi Germany. Both required Britain to commit fully to continental warfare. Both required coalition building and management. Both required leaders willing to take strategic risks. Churchill understood that Britain's survival sometimes requires engaging decisively in Europe, even when that's difficult and costly. David Chandler, one of the foremost military historians of the 18th century, called Marlborough's 1704 campaign probably the most brilliant in British military history. High praise from a scholar who'd studied every major British military operation across 3 centuries. Chandler particularly admired the integrated nature of the campaign, how Marlborough combined deception, logistics, diplomacy, and tactics into one seamless operation. In the end, Blenheim deserves to be remembered not just as a British victory, but as a demonstration of what's possible when brilliant leadership, careful planning, and sheer courage come together. Marlborough saw what needed to be done, planned meticulously, took calculated risks, and executed brilliantly. He saved Vienna, turned the war, preserved the balance of power in Europe, and established Britain as a major military force. The consequences of Blenheim rippled through the next century. British power grew steadily after 1704. The Royal Navy became dominant, protecting trade and enabling imperial expansion. Britain's commercial economy flourished. The country that had been relatively small and peripheral in European affairs became a great power, one of the arbiters of European politics. None of that was inevitable. If Vienna had fallen in 1704, if the French had won, Britain's trajectory would have been completely different. So the next time you think about important battles in British history, remember Blenheim. Remember the day a British general marched his army across Europe, brought a seemingly unbeatable enemy to battle, and won so completely that he changed the course of history. Remember the courage of soldiers who crossed a river under fire because their general asked them to. Remember the strategic genius that saw opportunity where others saw only impossibility. Remember that sometimes, at critical moments, individual actions matter enormously. The day British arms achieved their greatest triumph, the day Marlborough proved that brilliance and boldness could overcome any odds, the day Blenheim entered history. Even if later generations would forget the name, we shouldn't forget. This is our history, and it's worth remembering. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Battle of Blenheim and want to explore more forgotten moments in British history, please subscribe. We're dedicated to bringing you the battles, the personalities, and the turning points that shaped Britain and the world. Hit that like button if you learned something new today, and let us know in the comments what other historical topics you'd like us to cover. There are countless stories waiting to be told, and we're here to tell them. Thanks for watching, and remember, history isn't just about the famous battles everyone knows. Sometimes the most important moments are the ones that have been forgotten. We're here to bring them back to life.